Imagine you're a young American soldier deep in the suffocating jungles of Vietnam. The air is thick with heat and fear. You take one wrong step, and suddenly the ground beneath you gives way. You're falling into a trap you never saw coming. Your legs are impaled. You can't move, and somewhere in the darkness you hear footsteps coming closer. Subscribe to Darker Days, where we uncover history's darkest truths. Stories they don't dare teach you in school, told in all their disturbing detail. 1. Punji stake traps. Infection as a weapon. One of the Vietcong's most infamous torture devices was the Punji stake trap. These were sharpened bamboo spikes, sometimes coated with human or animal feces, to guarantee infection. The stakes were hidden in pits or concealed under leaves and grass. When a soldier fell in, the sharpened spikes would pierce deep into the legs, thighs, or feet. But the true weapon wasn't the injury. It was the slow, agonizing infection that followed. Many victims were left in excruciating pain for days, their wounds festering, unable to walk, waiting for rescue or capture. 2. Tiger cages. Living coffins. For those captured alive, the Vietcong sometimes used what were known as tiger cages. These were tiny bamboo or barbed wire enclosures, barely big enough to crouch in. Prisoners were left in these cages under the blistering sun during the day and in freezing rain at night. Movement was impossible. Food and water were scarce, and disease spread quickly. The psychological torment of being trapped, unable to lie down, while insects and rats crawled over your body, drove many prisoners to madness long before their bodies gave out. 3. Bouncing Betty mines, designed to maim, not kill. While technically a weapon, the Bouncing Betty was a calculated torture device. When triggered, the mine would launch into the air and explode at waist height, tearing apart legs and lower torsos. The Vietcong knew that a wounded soldier would tie up multiple men, medics, stretcher bearers, and escorts, making it a tactical and psychological win. Survivors often lived with horrific injuries, their pain stretched out over years. 4. Water torture and near drowning. Captured soldiers often spoke of being tied down and having water poured over their faces in a way that simulated drowning, an early version of what we now call waterboarding. The Vietcong's version was crude but effective: a rag over the face, buckets of filthy river water, and relentless repetition until the victim was gasping, choking, and begging for it to stop. In tropical humidity, the damp cloth could breed bacteria, leading to severe respiratory infections even if the prisoner survived the interrogation. 5. The bamboo whip trap. Pain that lingers. Deep in the jungle, the Vietcong mastered the art of turning nature into a weapon. One of their cruelest inventions was the bamboo whip trap. A long, flexible bamboo pole, often studded with sharpened spikes, was bent back and held under tension. The tripwire was almost invisible in the dense undergrowth. When triggered, the pole would whip forward with explosive force, slamming into the victim's torso, face, or legs. The spikes could slice flesh down to the bone. Survivors often described the pain as burning and tearing at the same time. And because bamboo splinters carry bacteria, wounds would quickly become infected, prolonging the suffering long after the initial strike. 6. The weighted drowning cage. Captured soldiers sometimes found themselves locked inside a crude bamboo or metal cage, weighted with rocks, and lowered into a river or swamp. The Vietcong would dunk the prisoner repeatedly, bringing them up just long enough to gasp for air before plunging them back under. This wasn't just about extracting information, it was about breaking a man's will. The water was often stagnant, filled with leeches and disease. Even if the victim survived, respiratory infections, parasites, and permanent lung damage were common outcomes. 7. The anthill torture. One of the most psychologically devastating punishments involved tying a prisoner to the ground directly over an anthill, or sometimes a nest of fire ants. The soldiers' arms and legs were spread and staked into the soil. Sometimes they were gagged to prevent screaming, other times left to cry out in pain. The ants, disturbed and aggressive, would swarm over the body, biting relentlessly. Victims often suffered hundreds of bites in a matter of minutes, leading to intense burning pain, allergic reactions, and even shock. The real cruelty lay in its simplicity. The jungle itself became the torturer. 8. The hanging cage, death in the air. The Vietcong occasionally suspended prisoners in small bamboo cages high above the ground, sometimes in the canopy, sometimes over rivers or swampy terrain. The cages were barely big enough to crouch in, forcing the body into painful, cramped positions. Exposure to tropical heat during the day and freezing monsoon rains at night quickly weakened the victim. Insects swarmed the helpless prisoner, and the constant fear of falling or being dropped intentionally kept the mind in a state of panic. Some were left there for days as a warning to passing troops. By the time they were lowered, they were often too weak to stand, if they were still alive at all. 9. The psychological war, torture without touch. Not all punishments were physical. The Vietcong understood that mental torment could be just as destructive. Captured soldiers were sometimes isolated in pitch-black pits for days or weeks with no sense of time. The only sounds were dripping water, distant jungle noises, and the occasional scream from another prisoner. At random intervals, guards would shout threats in broken English, fire guns nearby, or drop dead animals into the pit. Prisoners reported hallucinations, paranoia, and in some cases, complete mental breakdowns. These were not acts of random cruelty. They were deliberate, strategic, and meant to weaken the enemy long before a bullet was fired. 10. The punishment pits, trapped with death. Some of the most feared devices were the Vietcong's punishment pits. These were deep holes, often camouflaged with thin layers of foliage, designed not only to capture, but to maim and psychologically destroy. Inside, the pit walls were lined with sharpened stakes, angled downwards. If a soldier tried to climb out, the spikes would dig into his flesh. Some pits were partially flooded, forcing prisoners to stand in filthy, disease-ridden water for hours or days. Rats and snakes were often introduced into the pits to keep the victim in a constant state of terror. The psychological pressure of being trapped, injured, and surrounded by vermin often broke a man faster than the physical wounds. 11. The red ant barrel. In some reported cases, prisoners were shoved into large barrels filled with red ants or other biting insects. The barrel was sealed except for a small air hole. Every movement triggered a fresh wave of bites, and the air quickly became suffocating. The intent was to create total panic and exhaustion. In tropical heat, dehydration and shock could set in within hours. Those who survived bore scars, both physical and mental, that lasted for life. 12. The deliberate medical neglect. One of the more insidious torture methods was refusing treatment for injuries deliberately inflicted by traps or beatings. Wounds would be left open, attracting flies and infection. Guards sometimes poured dirty water or irritants like chili powder directly into cuts, amplifying the pain. Prisoners understood the message, every hour you live, you'll wish you hadn't. 13. The mock execution. Perhaps the most terrifying punishment of all was the mock execution. Prisoners were blindfolded, tied up, and forced to listen as guards prepared weapons, knives being sharpened, guns being loaded. Sometimes they'd be lined up alongside other prisoners and hear shots fired, followed by bodies hitting the ground. But it was staged. The goal was pure psychological destruction. Many prisoners later admitted that the waiting for death was worse than the thought of dying itself. Closing reflection. The Vietcong's brutal punishments were not acts of mindless cruelty. They were a calculated strategy of psychological warfare. Every trap, every cage, every act of torture was designed to send a message: you are not safe anywhere in this jungle. Subscribe to Darker Days for more disturbing stories from history's darkest corners. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. It helps more people discover the truth. What do you think is worse, physical torture or psychological warfare? Let us know in the comments below.